Hi everybody, welcome back. This is for our class for English 112 for Tuesday, the 1st of December. Hard to believe that we're already in December, and I hope you had a safe and happy Thanksgiving as we transition over to our last unit of the semester, which happens to be poetry. However, we have been talking about poetry actually in both units. The first, the short story unit, when we began with A Sorrowful Woman, we talked a little bit about how she was contemplating writing a sonnet being a very stylized and rigid form of writing. And in fact, that's what we will do next class. We'll examine a Shakespearean sonnet. And then when we talked about the drama section, both with Oedipus the King and with A Midsummer Night's Dream, we talked about how both of those plays were written in poetry, though in terms of Oedipus the King, we were reading a translation and the difficulties of a translation in order to keep the musical qualities of the poetry based on the sounds of the words, as well as also to keep the meaning, which changes from language to language. And for Shakespeare, we talked about how ultimately his poetry was very deliberate oftentimes in terms of illustrating things like social class. The higher the class, then the more likely the individual would be speaking poetry. And if the individual experienced some sort of a descent, then they would probably switch to prose or complete sentences. Though oftentimes we would have lower level characters speaking poetry, and this could be a way of Shakespeare illustrating that the lower levels of society had as much sophistication as the higher levels of society. And even with something like Raisin in the Sun, that ultimately was based on a Langston Hughes poem, A Dream Deferred, and the line A Raisin in the Sun comes from the poem itself, though the poem as a whole really illustrates much of what Hansberry was doing in the play. A play that was semi-autobiographical, by the way, because when Hansberry was a young child, her parents tried to move their family into an all-Caucasian neighborhood, and they experienced all kinds of violent fallout because of it and had to go through the court system in order to be able to maintain their legal right to stay, which they did. But here we are finally at the poetry section, and some due dates I wanted to remind you of. That at this point you should have handed in journal number 2 about drama that was due on the 24th of November, right before the Thanksgiving on Tuesday. And I believe I should have returned that back to you if you submitted it. So if I haven't, please contact me. I also believe I now have access to all of my old emails, so I'll be going through those and returning assignments to individuals. I know I have some paper revisions to work on. Again, if you're not quite sure if there's something that I have that I haven't returned to you, just contact me and I'll be happy to let you know. Paper number 2 on drama is going to be due on the 10th of December. So I'm hopeful that the comments that I wrote on the journal, as well as your own observations in the journal, can help you with the drama topics. But certainly feel free to contact me if you need some direction or ideas on how to proceed with that paper. But that paper is very similar to what you did with paper number 1. The difference being that you're focusing on drama rather than short story. But it's approximately 4 to 5 pages, double space 1-inch margins, and it is focused on a particular element within one of the 3 dramas that we've read over the course of the semester. And then finally, what you will have is a journal due on poetry at the very ending of our poetry unit. And that happens to be on the 15th of December, which is a Tuesday. And that basically is the ending of the semester for us, with the exception of the final examination. And the final exam is going to be on the 22nd of December. If we were meeting in person, there would be 2 separate sections of English 112, and we were assigned different times for the final. What I just decided to do was to combine us all into the section that would have the latest final exam, and that would be the 22nd of December at 10:30 a.m. I'll have that exam posted, and you'll have 24 hours to respond to that exam and return it to me. It's open book, open notes, so you can use all kinds of reference sources. By then, you should have your journals about poetry returned back to you, so that will help you as well. Because the bulk of the final is going to be devoted to poetry, 80 points. Basically, what I'm going to do is select a handful of the poems that we would have discussed in class and ask you to select 2 and to write an analysis of those poems. It's actually called an explication, and that's something that we will be talking about over the next couple of weeks. And in terms of the final 20 points for the exam, 10 points will be in relation to short story, 10 points will be in relation to drama. These will all be short essay exam questions that you've got choice within the exam and are all open book, open notes. So you can use previous journals and papers and notes as well from the class. The exam, if we were taking it in person, would be scheduled for approximately 2 hours. So that's what you should be basically devoting to the exam. You shouldn't think that you need to devote 24 hours to the exam. I just wanted to give all of you enough time to take that exam. If we were taking it in class and you went past the 2 hours, I would give you up to 3 hours if you needed to take that exam. So if you needed that time for that exam. So that's about the time that you should allot, 2 to 3 hours for taking that examination. In terms of where we are with poetry, the central question is, what is poetry? And there is no clear definition. And that's going to be today's attendance question, by the way, is how do you personally define poetry and why? But I can say that in terms of poetry, it oftentimes utilizes structures like rhyme and meter and alliteration. And what this is all about is the sounds of words. Poetry is a very oral kind of communication. And the epic poets, you think about the Iliad and the Odyssey, some great oral poets that ultimately, luckily, wrote down their work, or else we wouldn't have them to read as pieces of literature today. Poetry is probably closest to song. So if you're familiar with songs and lyrics of songs, then you might be familiar with elements such as rhyme, where the endings of words sound similar. Or you might be familiar with alliteration, when the beginnings of the words have similar sounds. Or meter, which happens to be the beat. Now, oftentimes in a song, what you've got are musical instruments, things like drums, for instance, to reinforce that musical beat. But that's not to say that the beat is not present, even if we didn't have the musical instruments. And that's what you've got with basically poetry. They're very much like lyrics. That said, poetry is very dense, it's very compact, it requires multiple rereadings. And I've been talking about reading 3 times over the course of the semester. The first for content, the second for analysis, and the third for basically refreshing your memory. But that may or may not be realistic when you're reading something as long and complex as a drama, but it is a requirement with poetry. And the shorter the poem, the more likely it is that you have to devote more attention to it. And just because poems oftentimes have rhyme, meter, and alliteration, that doesn't mean they always have rhyme, meter, and alliteration. If anything else, in terms of poetry, they oftentimes have that staggered line. They don't necessarily go to the ending of a margin the way that a complete sentence will. But I'd be very curious to hear what your definitions happen to be of poetry. Do know that poetry tends to examine emotional states very well, but we could say that of all literature. But perhaps poetry, more than any other form of literature, tries to articulate in language what feelings are, and that's a very difficult thing to do. Certainly, if you were to go and look up the dictionary definition of love, that is something that's probably pretty flat as compared to experiencing the emotion. We might have love illustrated in characterization in something like a short story or in a drama, but poetry perhaps tries to define in its own unique way what love is. But again, there are lots of different ways to define poetry. Some suggestions in terms of reading poetry. Read the poems out loud because you definitely want to hear the sound. There's a definite musical quality to them. Many of the poems can be found online where you can hear professional poetry readers read their poems. And with the more contemporary poets, actually hear the poets themselves read their poetry. And sometimes they do a good job and sometimes they do a bad job. Ultimately, they are writers. They're not necessarily readers. It would be the same with somebody who writes song lyrics. Sometimes they can sing their own song lyrics very well, and sometimes they can't, and somebody else needs to sing it for them. And there's an interpretive quality to it. So just like each song can be sung differently based on the singer's interpretation, each poem can be read differently based on the poetry reader's interpretation. The pleasure of words, and you can see all of this is in our notes below, on page 593 to 596, talks about the importance of reading critically and annotating. which is something we've been talking about over the course of the semester, that you want to write notes of things that occur to you that are important, which is basically what your journals are. But rather than you writing notes in the margin of your textbook, you're taking those notes and you're putting them online in a PDF so that I can read those notes. It's just much more efficient that way. But if you wanted to look on page 595, if you have a version of the textbook that I had ordered for class, you'll see that there's a poem called Uh-Oh. And what somebody has done is they have annotated that poem. They've put notes in the margins about things that seem to have been important to them, whether it be particular usages of language or whether it be the actual title itself and what it might mean. At this point in the semester, you know that titles can be very important in terms of understanding a work. And they would have underlined and highlighted particular areas. Not that this was in any way an all-inclusive list, but for instance, for the title, they indicated the title, Uh-Oh, offers an interpretation expressing strong emotion and perhaps foreboding. But of course, it depends on how you say it. There's a difference between saying uh-oh as if there's a small mistake as opposed to uh-oh, where it's something that's much more significant. So obviously tone of voice is important. And we'll get more of a sense of the tone by actually reading the poem itself and to try to get a sense of what kind of tone the author might have interpreted or might have suggested. There is a poem called Catch that I wanted to review with you. On pages 596 to 600, it talks about one of the ways of going through reading poetry is to first read it and paraphrase it. In other words, to summarize it in your own language about what's happening. And then afterwards, to go and to try to read the poem line by line, word by word, sometimes even piece of punctuation by piece of punctuation, and to try to determine any possible significances to that. That's what we call explication. It's a very detailed and specific reading where everything might have significance. And I thought I would read the poem on page 596, Catch, out loud to you so you could hear it. And again, reading for the very beginning, the author, Robert Francis, was born in 1901, died in 1987. He wrote Catch in 1950. Two boys uncoached are tossing a poem together. Overhand, underhand, backhand, sleight of hand, every hand. Teasing with attitudes, latitudes, interludes, altitudes. High, make him fly off the ground for it. Low, make him stoop. Make him scoop it up. Make him as almost as possible miss it. Fast, let him sting from it. Now fool him slowly. Anything, everything, tricky, risky, nonchalant. Anything under the sun to outwit the prosy. Over the tree in the long sweet cadence down, over his head, make him scramble to pick up the meaning. And now, like a posy, a pretty one plump in his hand. And I'm pretty sure that if you've read that or heard that for the first time, it won't make sense. So you'll have to read it multiple times. And what this particular reader has done is written a paraphrase that a poet's relationship to a reader is similar to a game of catch. The poem, like a ball, should be pitched in a variety of ways to challenge and create interest. Boredom and predictability must be avoided if the game is to be engaging and satisfying. But that's such a flat way of sort of thinking about the poem itself that begins with two boys uncoached. I suggest that the two is important because that's the relationship that we have with poetry, the writer and the reader. Boys, I think, is important because it illustrates youth, the idea that they are uncoached. They don't necessarily need to be schooled. Anybody can write and read and begin to interpret poetry. But obviously, the more experience they have and the more coaching they have, the better off they are. And considering the time period in which this poem was written, 1950, I'm not too surprised that we've got boys rather than girls or children, because ultimately catch was a game that would have been associated with males and perhaps still is today. And writing and reading poetry was something in the 1950s that was associated more with males than with females. If you remember, we talked about the literary canon, those works determined by scholars and critics to be worthy of study, and how often the literary canon was very male-centric in the past. And these two boys uncoached are tossing a poem together, the poem being basically much like a ball. And then we've got the repetition of hand in the second line. Overhand, underhand, backhand, sleight of hand, every hand. And that certainly makes sense in that hands are used for playing ball, but hands are used for writing, and perhaps even for reading poetry if you're annotating. Teasing, that's what poetry does in line 3. It's supposed to tease you. It won't give you an easy answer. With attitudes, latitudes, interludes, altitudes. Notice how the endings of those words sound the same, so they rhyme. High, make him fly off the ground, for low, make him stoop. Make him scoop it up, make him as almost as possible miss it. In other words, this is going to be a workout when you're playing a game of catch if it's going to be interesting and engaging. And it should be the same with reading and writing poetry, that it won't be too easy, that you're going to have to exercise your muscles, this being your brain muscles, as opposed to your physical muscles, let's say. Fast, let him sting from it. Now, fool him slowly. Maybe that's what poetry is trying to do, is to fool you, not necessarily to give you the answer immediately, but to hide it, and you need to uncover it. And that might be something that can be said of all of literature, but especially poetry. Anything, everything, tricky, risky, and nonchalant. That's what poetry is, things that are tricky and risky. Anything under the sun to outwit the prosy. It's about trying to be witty and to try to outwit, to do something in an unusual way. If you like riddles and things of that nature, then you understand the importance of wit. Over the tree in the long sweet cadence down. Cadence is sound, and the importance of sound and musicality in poetry. But also with playing catch, if you think about a ball flying through the air, whistling through the air. Over his head, make him scramble to pick up the meaning. We suggest that's what we are going to be doing at this ending of the semester, is trying to scramble to pick up the meaning, trying to figure out what do these poems mean. And now, like a posy, a pretty one plump in his hands. Notice all those P sounds. Posy, pretty, plump. And that is alliteration, the repetition of consonant sounds. And that also rhymes, or also is alliterative with the word play. And I think that's what catch is. It's a game in which you play. And that's also what reading and writing poetry is. It's a game. It's something that's play. So if you can keep it with that attitude, and I think that might help you in terms of understanding that poetry won't be straightforward, and that you don't necessarily have to come up with a definitive meaning. And while that was true with short story and drama, it's especially true with poetry. There are some suggestions for approaching poetry on page 606. So again, if you've ordered the textbook for this class, this may be a page that you may want to dog ear. Assume it's necessary to read a poem more than once. Pay attention to the title, is number 2. As you read the poem for the first time, avoid becoming entangled in words or lines that you don't understand. Instead, give yourself a chance to take in the entire poem first before attempting to resolve problems encountered along the way. 4, on a second reading, identify words and passages you don't understand. And that should be something that you do with all of literature, but especially with a poem that's so dense, so short, and so compact. Read the poem out loud, or perhaps have a friend read it to you. Read for the punctuation, pauses for commas, and things of that nature. Line breaks. Think about where the authors decided to break a line, and it probably isn't at the ending of the margin, or it may not also be at the ending of a sentence. So that's also something to keep in mind, that just because a line is ending, that doesn't necessarily mean the thought is ending. Paraphrase, or put in your own words what you think the poem might mean. Try to get a sense of who is speaking and the setting or situation. Don't just assume that it's the author. It could be a character that's created. Assume each element in the poem has a purpose, and the shorter the poem, the more likely it is that each element has a purpose. Be willing to entertain other perspectives, values, experiences, and subjects you might not agree with or approve of, which is true of all literature. Try developing a coherent approach to the poem that helps you discuss the text. You remember we began the semester by talking about different schools of interpretation, whether you wanted to read for deconstructionist theory, in other words, where you're looking for contradiction, as opposed to a feminist theory, where you might want to look for specifically the female gender and how that's portrayed in the text. And don't assume that you will produce a definitive reading of the poem. And there are 2 poems, one entitled The Magic of Love and the other entitled Love Poem, on page 608, that they use to illustrate the difference between formulaic poetry, poetry that Probably you might find in something like a greeting card. That might be another place where you would find a poem, where it's fairly superficial and it's fairly stereotypical and doesn't require a lot of thought or effort from you, as opposed to something like a poem that we would be reading in a literature class. And both of these poems are about love. Poetry is oftentimes about love. But the poem on page 609, The Magic of Love, which I wanted to read to you, is very much a poem that is trite and expected and formulaic. And we can see that it was written by Helen Ferries, who was born in 1918 and died in 2008. The date of the poem is is unknown, and the title is The Magic of Love. And this is how the poem reads. There's a wonderful gift that can give you a lift. It's a blessing from heaven above. It can comfort and bless. It can bring happiness. It's the wonderful magic of love. Take a star in the night. It can keep your faith bright. Like the sun, it can warm your hearts too. It's a gift you can give every day that you live, and when given, it comes back to you. When love lights the way, there is joy in the day, and all troubles are lighter to bear. Love is gentle and kind, and through love you will find there's an answer to your every prayer. May it never depart from your two loving hearts. May you treasure this gift from above. You will find if you do, all your dreams will come true in the wonderful magic of love. And notice how sing-song it is, and it does rhyme and it does have meter, but it doesn't have any kind of depth or sophistication to it. So it probably isn't worth much of our time. As opposed to another poem about love entitled Love Poem by John Frederick Nims that was written in 1947. He was born in 1913 and died in 1999. And this poem reads, My clumsiest dear, whose hands shipwreck vases, at whose quick touch all glasses chip and ring, whose palms are bulls in china, burrs in linen, and have no cunning with any soft thing. Except all ill at ease fidgeting people, the refugee uncertain at the door, you make it home. Deftly you steady the drunk, clamoring on his undulant floor. Unpredictable dear, the taxi driver's terror, shrinking from far headlights pale as a dime, yet leaping before red apoplectic streetcars, misfit in any space and never on time. A wrench in clocks in the solar system, only with words and people and love you move at ease. In traffic of wit expertly maneuver and keep us all devotion at your knees. Forgetting your coffee spreading on our flannel, your lipstick grinning on our coat, so gaily in love's unbreakable heaven, on our souls on glory of spilt bourbon float. Be with me, darling, early and late. Smash glasses. I will study rye music for your sake. For should your hands drop white and empty, all the toys of the world would break. And obviously this poem is much more sophisticated and requires much more thought and energy from you as a reader, and it's much less predictable. And we talked about how you could begin with a paraphrase, where basically if we needed to summarize this poem, we could say that this woman is very clumsy, at least when it comes to movement, but she's very graceful when it comes to social interactions. And another way of thinking about how we could examine this particular poem would be going through the poem line by line and, in fact, looking at each stanza. A stanza is much like a paragraph. So if you were looking at this poem, you can see that there are breaks after every fourth line. They almost look like paragraph breaks, and they serve the same function. So just like a paragraph break is used to illustrate a new topic, this stanza break, each stanza should represent a topic. And we could go through this poem stanza by stanza and read the first stanza, My clumsiest dear. And dear is a term of affection, but clumsy is not necessarily a compliment and not necessarily what you would expect in a love poem. My clumsiest dears who hands shipwreck vases. She doesn't just break vases. She shipwrecks them. And think about the associations with the shipwreck, catastrophe. At whose quick touch all glasses chip and ring. In other words, that whenever there's something that's made out of glass, there is the possibility of this person chipping it, making the glasses ring because they're knocking against one another. Whose palms are bulls in china, burrs in linen. and have no meaning with any soft thing. And I don't know if you've ever heard the expression a bull in a china shop, the idea that a bull is supposed to be clumsy and a china shop is filled with things that are very delicate. So in theory, the bull should be destroying everything in the china shop. Or a burr in linen. If you know a burr, which just happens to be a sticky plant that could catch onto clothing and very difficult to remove. So that's the first stanza, basically establishing the fact that she's quite clumsy. The second stanza is a complete shift. Except is how the second stanza begins. Except all at ease fidgeting people. That she's clumsy with things, but not with people, especially people who are ill at ease and fidgeting. The refugee uncertain at the door, you make it home. And think about the associations with the refugee, somebody who's homeless, not just somebody who's shy or socially awkward, somebody who has no place of belonging is at your door, but yet this person makes that person feel at home. Deftly, you steady the drunk clamoring on his undulate floor. And again, if you've ever been in this social situation, you know how awkward it is. Somebody's had too much to drink in your home. And how do you get them home safely? And how do you allow them to maintain their dignity? So the second stanza establishes that she's very good with people who are socially awkward. And then the third stanza goes back to the idea of her clumsiness. Unpredictable, dear. Again, dear, a term of affection. I don't know if unpredictable is necessarily a positive. The taxi driver's terror, shrinking from far headlights pale as a dime, yet leaping before red apoplectic streetcars. You think about some of the associations with taxi drivers, especially the time this poem was written, that they are crazy drivers. And yet taxi drivers are afraid of her because of her horrible driving and her unpredictability. That she's the kind of driver that shrinks from far headlights pale as a dime. In other words, she's afraid to make that left turn. Even though the car is far, far away from her, she's still afraid to make that left. Yet leaping before red apoplectic streetcars. Yet she also does very unsafe things like trying to turn onto, let's say, a streetcar or a train track when it's unsafe. She's a misfit in any space and never on time. And I'll explain why I'm using the pronoun she in a moment. When we get to the next stanza, where the first line is about her, again, clumsiness and her inability to manage time well. That this person is a wrench in clocks and the solar system. Can you imagine how bad this person is with time to completely disrupt the solar system itself? But then the rest of that stanza talks about this person's grace with people. Only with words and people in love you move at ease. In traffic of wit expertly maneuver. And I love that line because we were just talking about what a terrible driver this person was. But you can have a traffic of wit. That speaking can be much like trying to negotiate traffic in a car. A conversation or a relationship can be like trying to negotiate traffic. It can be stop and go. Some are very skilled at it, and some are very poor at it. You can have an accident, or things can go very quickly and you have smooth sailing. So in a traffic of wit, expertly maneuver and keep us. So the idea is that this isn't just one person, it's probably the family speaking. All devotion at your knees. This is how much they love her, that they are devoting her, or that they feel devotion for her, that they would actually be at her knees, that they would kneel in front of her. And then the next stanza, forgetting your coffee spreading on our flannel. In other words, this is somebody who always spills coffee on other people. Your lipstick grinning on our coat. This is somebody who leaves behind lipstick. Considering the time period this was written, 1947, the guess is that this poem is probably written to a female, though it is possible for males to wear lipstick, but again, in 1947, it's probably more likely that this is in reference to a female. Your lipstick grinning on our coat. So gaily in love's unbreakable heaven. That's the one thing that can't be broken is love, even though glasses can be broken. Our souls on glory of spilt bourbon float. And most people would be upset if a drink had been spilled, such as bourbon, but this person is saying that they feel joy and happiness, because if something has been spilled or broken, that means the subject of this poem is nearby and they love this person. And then the very last stanza. Be with me, darling. Darling, another term of affection. Early and late. Again, it doesn't matter if this person is early or late or how much they're a wrench in the solar system. Smash glasses. In other words, break everything. I will study rhyme music for your sake. That the sound of something breaking is musical because that means that person is nearby. It's not uncomfortable or jarring. For should your hands drop wide and empty, and the time when somebody's hands drop wide and empty is when they've died. So if this person were to die, all the toys of the world would break. And I love that line. You think about how sad that would be if all of the toys of the world would break. Toys representing things that are positive and filled with joy and youth and happiness. And when those things break, how sad it is. In other words, as long as this person is alive, this family loves her. It doesn't matter how awkward she is physically, because she's graceful socially and with love. And one could say that this poem is much more of a realistic love poem than the wonderful magic of love that said all of those cliche things, but really didn't have any significance. In fact, something like love poem, by talking about this person's negatives, just in any way, adjustments in many ways, just reinforces the importance of the positives. So this was our introduction to the poetry section. I'm almost done. Next class, I wanted to talk about scanning a poem, reading a poem so that you could determine whether or not there's a pattern of rhyme or a pattern of meter, much like you can diagram a sentence and determine what the parts of speech are for that sentence. It's a useful exercise, though I don't think it necessarily is that useful in terms of understanding in relation to analysis. So we'll talk about that and a little bit about writing about poetry, and then we will begin our poetry unit. So basically, starting next class, any of those poems that we discuss are poems that you can discuss in journals and could be poems that could appear on the final exam, beginning with Shakespeare's sonnet, probably his most famous sonnet of all, Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day? So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on with our poetry next class. And today's attendance question, due Wednesday, the 2nd of December, 10 a.m. on our discussion forum. What is your personal definition of poetry? What is your personal definition of poetry and why? Take care. Bye-bye.